The sun was beginning to set over the quiet countryside of Emberfield, casting long shadows across the desolate highway. This stretch of road, miles away from any major city, was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. A lone rest stop emerged on the horizon, its weathered sign barely visible in the fading light. Inside, the air was still and calm, with only the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clink of cutlery breaking the silence. The rest stop diner, with its faded vinyl booths and dusty windows, seemed like the last place anyone would expect anything unusual to happen. Marine veteran Michael Winston pulled into the lot, his mind set on grabbing a quick coffee before continuing his drive. To anyone else, this place might seem like a forgettable pit stop, but for Michael, it was just another location where his finely tuned instincts kicked in. Despite being back on American soil, his military training made it impossible to switch off the constant need to assess his surroundings. As he stepped inside, Michael's eyes immediately scanned the room. Years of service had taught him that no detail was too small, and today would be no exception. There was the usual crowd, a couple of truckers nursing their coffees, an elderly woman picking at a slice of pie, and a man in a suit engrossed in his newspaper. But then his gaze landed on a small figure seated near the window, and everything changed. A young black girl, no more than 8 years old, sat quietly in a yellow booth, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Across from her sat an older white man, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, dressed in a navy blue suit. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The girl's body language told a story that the calm atmosphere of the diner didn't reflect. Her hands fidgeted, her wide eyes never settling on any one thing for too long. It was a sharp contrast to the man sitting across from her, who remained stoic, hidden behind his newspaper, occasionally peering over the top to glance at the girl with a gaze that felt unnervingly intense. Michael's gut churned with suspicion. He knew better than to jump to conclusions, but this wasn't just a tired child sitting with her father. There was an unsettling tension between them, one that felt too controlled, too rehearsed. The stark difference in race and age could easily have an innocent explanation. Perhaps she was adopted, or he was a family friend. But it was the look in the girl's eyes, that raw flicker of fear, that set Michael on edge. As he made his way to the counter to order a coffee, his mind was already working, processing the situation. He wasn't here to cause trouble, and certainly didn't want to make a scene based on gut instinct alone. But the more he watched, the more the pieces didn't seem to fit. The girl's gaze briefly met his, and in that moment, Michael's heart rate quickened. There was something there, a silent cry for help, buried beneath the surface. He couldn't put his finger on it just yet, but he knew better than to ignore his instincts. She looked away just as quickly, her small hands trembling as she pressed them to her lap, as if trying to shrink into herself. The man remained calm, his eyes flicking between his newspaper and the girl, his expression unreadable. Michael had seen this kind of controlled composure before, in situations where power dynamics were at play. Something in the man's behavior felt off, too measured, too careful. He watched as the man glanced around the diner, subtly scanning the room as if to see if anyone was paying attention. When he thought no one was watching, his gaze would shift back to the girl, a flicker of something darker passing through his eyes. Michael's training had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He had been in enough high-pressure situations to know when something wasn't right. But here, in this quiet rest stop far from any battlefield, he found himself caught between two worlds, the soldier in him urging him to act, and the civilian in him reminding him to be cautious. He was back home now. This wasn't a combat zone, but sometimes the dangers at home were the hardest to see. His coffee arrived, and he took a slow sip, positioning himself near the vending machines where he could keep a better eye on the girl and the man without drawing too much attention. He would wait. He needed more information before he could justify any action, but every fiber of his being told him that this wasn't something he could simply ignore. The girl's fingers began tapping a soft rhythm on the table, her feet swinging beneath the booth, unable to touch the ground. Every few moments she would glance up at the man, only to look away quickly when their eyes met. It was a small detail, but it screamed of discomfort, fear even. The man, on the other hand, maintained an air of detached calm, his attention seemingly focused on his paper. But Michael had caught him more than once glancing at the girl from behind the pages, his eyes sharp and calculating. In the military, Michael had learned to trust his gut. A small detail, a look, a movement. These things could mean the difference between safety and danger. And right now, his gut was screaming at him to stay vigilant. He watched as the man's eyes flicked toward the diner door, as if checking for anyone else coming in. Michael's mind raced. Was he overreacting? Could this just be a misunderstanding? A simple case of nerves from a shy child and her overbearing guardian? Or was there something more sinister at play? The sun continued to set outside, casting the diner in a dim glow as Michael's watchful eyes stayed locked on the odd pair in the corner. He wasn't leaving just yet. Not until he had answers. Michael leaned back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding across the diner. The girl's fingers continued their nervous tapping on the table, her body language betraying an anxiety that gnawed at him. Her shoulders were hunched, and she kept her eyes low, only glancing up when she thought no one was watching. He could feel the weight of her fear, even from where he stood. Meanwhile, the man opposite her remained a fortress of composure, a figure that exuded calm control. His actions, however subtle, sent small alarm bells ringing in Michael's mind. Every once in a while, the man would lower the newspaper, look around the room, and then peer at the girl, his expression changing in ways that were hard to define, but unmistakably unsettling. This wasn't right. But how could Michael be sure? He wasn't here to make assumptions, especially not in today's world where misunderstandings could lead to chaos. Yet his instincts were sharper than ever. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The girl's hand gestures were the most troubling part. She had already done it twice, lifting her hand slightly, palm open, fingers spread apart, and then quickly dropping it back into her lap. The gesture was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't paying close attention. But Michael noticed. He had seen a gesture like that before, in training during his time in the military. It wasn't just a random movement. It was deliberate. It was a silent SOS. His mind raced, recalling the countless briefings and rescue missions where signals like these were used by people in distress, unable to speak freely. The thought chilled him. Could this child be trying to signal for help? And if so, what exactly was she afraid of? The man sitting across from her seemed calm. Too calm, perhaps, but calm nonetheless. As the seconds ticked by, Michael's internal debate intensified. Should he act now? Or was this a misunderstanding? He'd been trained to handle dangerous situations, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where danger was clear and present. This was a diner in a quiet corner of America, and yet it felt like the calm before a storm. The girl's hand twitched again. Her eyes flickered toward Michael, just for a split second, and he saw it. Fear. Real, unmistakable fear. There was something in the way her eyes darted from him to the man that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. This wasn't just a nervous child. This was a child in trouble. His mind was racing through the possibilities. What if the man was her father or a guardian? What if the girl was just shy, anxious in public places, and Michael was reading too much into it? It would be easy to explain away her behavior as normal, especially given the racial difference that made the scene stand out in ways that might lead others to ignore any signs of trouble. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just awkwardness or shyness. It was deeper, darker. The man folded his newspaper and took a long, deliberate sip of his coffee. His gaze never wavered from the girl. His hands, steady and composed, rested on the table, fingers drumming a rhythm that mimicked the girl's nervous tapping. Michael caught the small details, the controlled breathing, the deliberate movements. He had seen men like this before, men who knew how to keep their emotions tightly locked down. They were the most dangerous kind because they were unpredictable. Michael's stomach churned. He couldn't just sit here and do nothing. He needed more information. He needed to know if this was a genuine situation of distress or if his mind was playing tricks on him. Taking a deep breath, he decided to move in closer, not directly, but subtly. He would walk by their table, maybe get a better read on the man's demeanor, and, more importantly, on the girl's reaction to him. As he approached, Michael noticed the way the girl stiffened in her seat. Her eyes remained fixed on the table, but her hands clutched the edge of it, knuckles turning white. The man glanced up at Michael as he passed, giving a brief, forced smile. There was something about the man's expression that was unsettling. It wasn't the casual smile of someone sharing a meal with a child. It was tight, controlled, almost as if it were masking something underneath. Michael walked past them, pretending to head for the restroom. As he did, he caught the girl's gaze again. This time there was no mistaking the message in her eyes. "Help me." It was subtle, a fleeting glance, but it was enough. The knot in Michael's stomach tightened as he continued walking. Something was very wrong here, and it was time to stop second-guessing himself. He paused in the hallway near the restroom, his mind racing with what to do next. Should he approach the man? Ask if everything was okay? But if he was wrong, if this was just a misunderstanding, he could escalate a situation unnecessarily. He had been trained to act, but in a civilian setting like this, the consequences of a mistake were different. Then again, what if he did nothing? What if this was more than just a case of an overprotective guardian or a shy child? What if this was something much darker, and he walked away without acting? The weight of that possibility settled heavily on his shoulders. No, he couldn't ignore this. He couldn't risk leaving that little girl to face whatever danger was lurking in front of her. Michael retraced his steps, returning to the main area of the diner. He took his coffee back to his spot by the vending machines, keeping the pair in his peripheral vision. He needed to be smart about this. Drawing attention too quickly could tip the man off, and that could make things worse. No. He needed to observe a little longer, wait for the right moment, and then act. The minutes ticked by slowly. Michael's senses were heightened, every movement, every glance analyzed. The girl's hands had gone still, her body rigid with tension. The man, on the other hand, seemed to relax more with each passing moment, his confidence growing as if he sensed that no one was paying attention. That overconfidence, Michael knew, was dangerous. As the diner continued its quiet routine, Michael felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew he had to make a move, but it had to be the right one. He couldn't just confront the man outright. If he was wrong, it would cause unnecessary panic. But if he was right, if the girl was in real danger, then every second mattered. His military instincts kicked in. He mentally mapped out the exits, the layout of the diner, the number of people inside. If this situation escalated, he needed to be prepared to move quickly. He couldn't afford to let the man slip away, not if this was what he feared it might be. Michael's eyes flicked toward the girl again, just in time to see her make the hand gesture one more time, palm open, fingers splayed, just as subtle as before. But this time, her eyes locked onto his, wide and pleading. There was no more doubt. This was a cry for help, and it was real. His pulse quickened. He had waited long enough. It was time to act. He stood up, setting his coffee cup down on the counter with a quiet clink. His mind raced through the possibilities of how to approach this. Should he ask if the girl was okay directly? Would that cause the man to panic, or worse, to hurt her? No, he needed a more subtle approach, something that would allow him to gauge the situation without immediately escalating it. Taking a deep breath, Michael made his way toward their table. The man looked up as he approached, his expression cool and composed. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something defensive. He wasn't expecting anyone to intervene, and that alone was enough to tell Michael that his instincts had been right. "Everything okay here?" Michael asked casually, his tone friendly but firm. He directed his question toward the girl, though he kept the man in his line of sight. The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting toward the man, as if seeking permission to speak. The man gave a tight-lipped smile, speaking before the girl had a chance to respond. "We're fine," the man said, his voice smooth but with a hint of tension. "Just grabbing a bite to eat before we hit the road." Michael's eyes remained on the girl. He could see the conflict in her expression, the way her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. She wanted to speak, but fear held her back. It was written all over her small face. Before Michael could respond, the girl raised her hand once more, the gesture so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. But Michael didn't. He saw it clearly. Her small fingers splayed out in a silent SOS. His decision was made. He knew he couldn't leave the situation to chance. His options raced through his mind. Should he call for backup or try to keep the situation calm and controlled? Michael's heartbeat quickened, and with it, a surge of adrenaline reminded him that this was no longer a casual interaction. This was an urgent cry for help. And now, he had no choice but to act decisively. Michael's pulse quickened as he processed the subtle yet unmistakable SOS gesture from the girl. It was clear to him now. This wasn't just his imagination or an innocent misinterpretation. This was real. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of the quiet diner was now boiling over, and Michael knew he had to act, but carefully. One wrong move could escalate the situation, or put the girl in even more danger. Taking a deep breath, Michael leaned in slightly, directing his attention more firmly toward the man. "You sure everything's okay?" he asked again, this time with a hint of steel behind his words. His tone was still calm, but there was a subtle shift, enough to signal to the man that Michael wasn't just making casual conversation. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, his tight-lipped smile faltering for a split second. He seemed to sense the shift as well, and the tension between the two of them became palpable. "Yeah, we're fine," the man replied, his voice still smooth but with an underlying edge of defensiveness. "Just a quick bite before we get back on the road." Michael didn't miss how the man's hand twitched ever so slightly on the table, his fingers curling into a subtle fist. It was the kind of movement that only someone trained to notice details would catch. To most, it would seem like a natural adjustment, but to Michael, it was a sign of something darker. Something that confirmed the man was on high alert now, ready to react if needed. The girl's eyes flickered between the two men, her small body practically shrinking into the booth. Her fingers continued to fidget in her lap, and Michael could see the fear etched into her young face. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was terrified. Michael's stomach turned. He knew that look. He'd seen it on the faces of people in dangerous situations, trapped with no way out. It was time to stop playing it safe. Michael straightened up, making a conscious decision to stand his ground. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked, but he didn't wait for an answer. He pulled up a chair from a nearby table and slid it next to their booth, positioning himself directly in front of the girl and between her and the man. The man's jaw tightened visibly, and Michael could feel the sudden spike of tension. "You look a little tense," Michael said, turning his attention to the girl. "Is everything all right? You need anything?" The girl opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She glanced quickly at the man, and the movement was so slight that most people would have missed it. But Michael didn't. The way her eyes darted toward the man before she looked down at her lap again sent alarm bells ringing in his head. She was afraid to speak. Michael's eyes flicked back to the man, who was now sitting rigidly, his hands clenched into tight fists on the table. His face was a mask of forced composure, but Michael could see the cracks beginning to form. The man was growing agitated, and that was dangerous. Agitation could lead to panic, and panic could lead to violence. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Michael could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His military training kicked in, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He needed to de-escalate the situation, but he also needed to get the girl to safety. The man was on edge, and if he made the wrong move, things could spiral out of control fast. "How about I grab you guys something to drink?" Michael suggested, his voice casual, but his eyes never leaving the man's face. "It's on me." The man's eyes narrowed, clearly suspicious of Michael's intentions, but he didn't object. "Sure," he said, his voice clipped and tense. Michael stood up slowly, making sure to keep his movements calm and controlled. He needed to buy time, needed to think. As he walked to the counter, he kept one eye on the pair in the booth, never letting them out of his sight. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the knowledge that the next few minutes could determine everything. When he reached the counter, Michael signaled the waitress with a nod and leaned in close, his voice low. "Call the police," he whispered, keeping his tone calm and steady. "Tell them there's a potential kidnapping in progress." The waitress's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't hesitate. She nodded quickly and moved toward the phone, her movements careful not to draw attention. Michael turned back toward the booth, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to keep the situation under control until the authorities arrived, but the clock was ticking, and he knew it wouldn't take much for things to escalate. As he approached the table again, he noticed a shift in the man's posture. His body was coiled tightly, like a spring ready to snap. Michael sat back down, placing the drinks on the table in front of them. "So, where are you two headed?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light and casual, even though every fiber of his being was screaming that something was about to go wrong. The man forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a road trip," he said, his voice strained. "Nothing special." Michael could tell that the man was growing more and more uncomfortable with each passing second. His fingers drummed on the table, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door, as if he were calculating his next move. The girl, meanwhile, sat frozen, her eyes locked on the table in front of her, her small hands trembling in her lap. "Road trips can be fun," Michael said, trying to keep the conversation going, trying to stall. "Where are you guys coming from?" The man's jaw clenched. "Does it matter?" he snapped, his voice sharper than before. The mask was slipping, and Michael could see the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Michael didn't flinch. "Just making conversation," he said calmly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "You seem a little on edge. Everything all right?" The man's eyes flashed with something dangerous, and for a moment, Michael thought he might lash out. But then, just as quickly, the man forced himself to relax, leaning back in the booth and crossing his arms over his chest. "Everything's fine," he said, though his tone was anything but convincing. Michael knew he was running out of time. The man was on the verge of losing his composure, and the girl was still sitting there, silent and terrified. The situation was a powder keg, and it wouldn't take much to set it off. Just then, the door to the diner swung open, and Michael's heart leapt into his throat. 2 police officers entered, their eyes scanning the room. Michael caught their attention with a subtle nod, and they moved toward the booth with purpose. The man noticed the officers immediately, and Michael could see the panic flash across his face. His hands clenched into fists again, and Michael knew he had to act fast. "Hey," Michael said softly, leaning in toward the man. "Let's keep this calm, all right? No need to make a scene." The man's eyes darted between Michael and the approaching officers, his breathing quickening. For a moment, it looked like he might try to run, but before he could make a move, the officers reached the table. "Sir, we need to have a word with you," one of the officers said, his voice firm but calm. The man's eyes flicked toward the girl, and Michael saw his hand twitch as if he were about to grab her. Instinct took over, and in one swift motion, Michael reached out and placed his hand firmly on the man's arm. "Don't," Michael said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's over." The man froze, his eyes wide with panic. The officers moved in quickly, taking hold of him and pulling him out of the booth. The girl let out a small gasp, and Michael immediately turned his attention to her. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling down next to her. "You're safe now. It's okay." The girl's eyes were wide with fear, but there was a flicker of relief in them as well. She nodded slowly, her small hand still trembling in her lap. As the officers escorted the man out of the diner, Michael stayed with the girl, keeping his voice calm and soothing. He could feel the adrenaline still pumping through his veins, but there was a sense of relief now too. He had made the right call, and the girl was safe. The waitress approached, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Are you okay?" she asked the girl, her voice soft. The girl nodded again, her eyes still wide but no longer filled with terror. "Thank you," the waitress said to Michael, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Michael offered a small, reassuring smile. "Just doing what needed to be done." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael's heart ached as he looked at her, this small child who had been so close to something terrible. He didn't know the full story yet, who this man was, why he had taken her. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was safe now. The police would handle the rest. The air in the diner felt electric with the tension that had just snapped. The man, now firmly in the grip of two officers, glared at Michael with wild eyes. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a desperate primal energy. Michael knew that look. It was the look of a man who had lost control and was now facing the consequences. As the officers pulled the man toward the door, he struggled briefly, trying to break free, but it was useless. They had him, and there was no escaping the reality that had just descended upon him. The girl, still sitting in the booth, stared down at her hands, her body trembling as if the fear that had been building inside her for hours was finally starting to pour out. Michael knelt beside her, speaking softly. "You're safe now," he repeated, his voice calm and steady. "No one's going to hurt you." She didn't respond at first, her wide eyes still fixated on the table in front of her. But then, slowly, she turned her head toward him, her lower lip quivering. There was a flicker of trust in her eyes, just a flicker, but it was enough for Michael to see that she believed him. For now, that was all he needed. The officers escorted the man out of the diner, his muffled protests barely audible over the sound of the door closing behind them. Michael stood up slowly, exhaling the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced around the diner, the other patrons staring in stunned silence at what had just unfolded. Somehow, the ordinary quiet rest stop had become the scene of a dramatic confrontation. And though the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline still coursed through Michael's veins. The waitress approached, still visibly shaken. Is she all right?" she asked, glancing nervously at the girl. Michael nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. "She's safe now. That's what matters." He turned back to the girl. "Do you want something to drink? Water? Anything?" The girl shook her head, her eyes still wide and fearful. Michael crouched beside her again, trying to make himself as unthreatening as possible. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the door where the man had been taken away, and then back to Michael. "Zoe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Zoe," Michael repeated with a soft smile. "That's a nice name. My name's Michael. Can you tell me, was that man your father?" Zoe's face paled and she shook her head violently. "No," she blurted out, her voice breaking. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly covered her face with her small hands. Michael's heart sank. He didn't need to hear any more to understand the gravity of what had almost happened. This wasn't just a case of a troubled family dynamic. This was a kidnapping. He stood up, glancing toward the door where the officers had taken the man. They needed to get more information, quickly. Michael had already called the police, but now that the immediate danger had passed, there was a flood of questions racing through his mind. Who was this man? How had he managed to take Zoe? And most importantly, where was her family? Michael stepped outside, leaving Zoe in the care of the waitress for the moment. The cold evening air hit his face like a wake-up call, snapping him out of the fog of adrenaline that had enveloped him since he first walked into the diner. The two officers were by their patrol car, the man in the back seat, still struggling against his cuffs, though his energy seemed to be fading as reality set in. Michael approached the officers, his voice low but firm. "Do you know who that guy is? Because that girl inside, Zoe, she just told me he's not her father." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions growing grimmer by the second. "We'll run his ID," one of them said, pulling out a notepad. "But if she says he's not her father, we need to dig deeper. This could be a lot worse than we thought." Michael nodded, his gut churning with the implications of what was unfolding. He had seen a lot during his time in the military, but there was something about this that felt even more sinister. The quiet rest stop, the innocent diner, the girl in the red dress. It all seemed like the perfect cover for something much darker. The kind of thing people didn't talk about, but that happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. "Let me talk to her a bit more," Michael said, turning back toward the diner. "Maybe I can get some more information out of her before she shuts down completely." The officers nodded, one of them already radioing in for backup and additional resources. This was no longer just a routine call. They were dealing with a potential child abduction, and that meant every second counted. Michael re-entered the diner, where Zoe was still sitting quietly in the booth, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked so vulnerable, so scared, and Michael's heart ached for her. He knew she needed reassurance, but more than that, she needed to feel safe again. He slid into the booth across from her, his voice calm and soothing. "Zoe, I know you're scared," he said gently. "But the police are here now. They're going to help you. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Zoe nodded slowly, though her eyes were still filled with fear. "Where's my dad?" she asked in a tiny voice, her lower lip trembling. Michael's chest tightened. "We're going to find him," he promised. "I need you to tell me, do you know where he is, or where you were when that man took you?" Zoe hesitated, biting her lip. She glanced down at her lap, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her red dress. I was at school," she whispered. "He told me he was taking me to see my mom." Michael's stomach turned. "Your mom?" he asked gently. "Do you know where she is?" Zoe shook her head, her small shoulders trembling. She's gone. My dad said she's gone." Michael's heart sank. Zoe's mother was out of the picture, and now it looked like someone had used that to take advantage of her. "Okay," Michael said, keeping his voice steady. "And the man who took you, did you know him? Have you seen him before?" Zoe shook her head again, her eyes wide with fear. "No," she whispered. "I don't know him. He just told me to come with him." Michael clenched his fists under the table, fighting back the anger that was bubbling up inside him. Whoever this man was, he had preyed on a vulnerable child, and Michael knew that if he hadn't been there, the outcome could have been far worse. "Zoe," Michael said softly, leaning forward slightly. "You're really brave, you know that? What you did back there, that hand signal, it saved you. That was really smart." Zoe looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I saw it on TV once," she whispered. They said if you're in trouble, you should do it." Michael smiled gently. "Well, you did the right thing," he said. "And now you're safe because of it." Zoe nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Michael could see the exhaustion in her small frame, the way her body sagged as the adrenaline began to fade. She had been through so much in such a short time, and now that the immediate danger was over, the weight of it all was crashing down on her. The door to the diner opened again, and one of the officers entered, walking over to where Michael and Zoe were sitting. "We've got the guy's ID," the officer said, his voice low. "He's got a record, nothing too serious, but enough to raise some red flags. We're looking into his connection to Zoe's mom." Michael nodded, his gut telling him that there was more to this story than they realized. "What about her dad?" he asked. "Has anyone contacted him yet?" The officer shook his head. "Not yet. We're working on it. We need to make sure we get all the details before we bring him in." Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't enough. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Zoe had been through enough already, and the sooner they could reunite her with her father, the better. As the officer walked away, Michael turned his attention back to Zoe. "Hey," he said softly. "Do you want to call your dad? I'm sure he'd love to hear your voice right now." Zoe hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Michael pulled out his phone, handing it to her. "Here," he said gently. "You can use this." Zoe took the phone with trembling hands, and Michael watched as she dialed the number. Her small voice cracked as she spoke, barely above a whisper. "Daddy," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "Daddy, I'm scared." Michael's heart broke as he listened to her speak, her voice shaky and filled with fear. But as she spoke to her father, he could see some of the tension start to leave her body. She was still scared, still traumatized, but at least she knew she wasn't alone anymore. After a few minutes, Zoe handed the phone back to Michael, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "That's good," he said softly. "You're going to be okay, Zoe. I promise." Zoe nodded, but Michael could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She had been through so much, and now all she wanted was to be with her father again. Michael knew that feeling all too well. The need to be with someone you trust, someone who makes you feel safe after everything else has fallen apart. As the hours passed and the police continued their investigation, Michael stayed by Zoe's side, offering her quiet reassurances as they waited for her father to arrive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the diner swung open, and a man rushed inside, his face etched with worry and fear. "Daddy!" Zoe cried, leaping out of the booth and running toward him. Her father dropped to his knees, gathering her into his arms as tears streamed down both their faces. "Zoe," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. You're safe now. I've got you." Michael watched the reunion from a few feet away, his chest tight with emotion. He had done what needed to be done, but seeing Zoe reunited with her father, seeing the relief and love in their embrace, made it all worth it. The police would take care of the rest now, and Michael knew that Zoe's nightmare was finally over. Zoe's father held her tightly, as if he couldn't believe she was really there in his arms. He rocked her gently, murmuring reassurances while tears of relief streaked down his face. The raw emotion in the room was palpable, and for a moment, the rest of the diner faded away. All that mattered was this reunion, a father and his daughter, safe together after the harrowing ordeal they had just been through. Michael stood nearby, giving them space, but close enough to be present in case Zoe needed him. He had been through situations like this before, though never as a civilian. The chaos and confusion that followed a moment of rescue, the emotional weight that settled in when the dust cleared. For Zoe and her father, this was the end of their nightmare. But for Michael, the story wasn't quite over yet. There were still questions that needed answers about the man who had taken Zoe, about how this had happened, and about the long road ahead for this family. The police officers approached Michael after a few minutes, one of them nodding respectfully as they made their way toward him. "We've got the guy in custody," the officer said, his voice low. "He's being processed right now. From what we can tell, he's not a random stranger. There's a connection to Zoe's mother. We're still digging into the details, but it looks like this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing." Michael's stomach churned. He had suspected as much. "So this was planned?" he asked, his tone grim. The officer nodded. "Looks that way. We're still piecing it together, but it seems like he's been working with Zoe's mother for a while, possibly planning to take Zoe out of the country. It's not clear why yet, but given his record..." Michael raised an eyebrow. "His record?" "Yeah," the officer confirmed. "Nothing violent, just fraud, identity theft, that kind of thing. but it looks like he's been using those skills to set up some kind of false identity for Zoe. We think the plan was to take her somewhere far away, where no one would find them. Michael's blood ran cold. The thought of what could have happened if he hadn't been there, if he hadn't noticed the girl's subtle cry for help, made his stomach twist. And Zoe's mother? Michael asked. Where is she in all of this? We're still trying to track her down, the officer replied. It's possible she's already out of the country, or she could be lying low somewhere. Either way, we're coordinating with other agencies to figure out her role in this. It's going to take some time. Michael nodded, his mind racing with the implications. This wasn't just a random abduction. This was a planned operation, something that had been carefully orchestrated. Zoe had been in more danger than anyone realized, and if Michael hadn't acted when he did, the outcome could have been devastating. Thank you, the officer said after a moment, his tone sincere, for what you did today. Not many people would have noticed what you noticed, or had the guts to step in the way you did. You probably saved that little girl's life. Michael shook his head, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. I just did what anyone should have done, he said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have picked up on the subtle signals, or had the experience to trust their instincts in the way he had. But even so, he didn't want praise. He just wanted Zoe to be safe. Zoe's father approached them, still holding his daughter close, his eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved my little girl. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Michael gave a small, humble smile. You don't need to thank me, he replied quietly. I'm just glad she's safe now. But Zoe's father shook his head. No, you don't understand, he said, his voice breaking slightly. This wasn't just about today. There's been a custody battle, a messy one. I thought we were past it. I thought Zoe was safe with me, but I had no idea her mother would go this far. Michael's eyes narrowed. Her mother was involved in this? Zoe's father nodded, his expression darkening. Yeah, I knew she was angry about losing custody, but I never thought she'd go to these lengths. I should have known better. She's been unstable for a while, and I should have taken more precautions. I should have seen this coming. Michael placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. You can't blame yourself for this, he said firmly. There's no way you could have known she'd do something like this. Zoe's father looked down at his daughter, his face etched with guilt. Maybe, he murmured. But still, I'm so thankful you were there. Zoe, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, suddenly turned her face up to Michael. Her small voice broke the tension in the air. Thank you, she whispered again, her words trembling. Michael smiled gently, kneeling down to her level. You're welcome, Zoe, he said softly. You're a very brave girl, you know that? Zoe managed a tiny smile, her eyes still filled with tears. I was scared, she admitted, her voice shaking. I know, Michael replied, his voice full of warmth. But you did the right thing. You asked for help, and that was really smart. I'm proud of you. Zoe nodded slowly, still clutching her father's hand tightly, as if afraid to let go. Michael stood up, knowing that the worst of the day was behind them, but understanding that there would still be many difficult moments ahead. Zoe would need time to heal, and her father would need to navigate the legal battles that were sure to follow. But for now, they had each other, and that was what mattered most. As the officers began to wrap up their investigation, Michael stepped outside the diner to get some fresh air. The sky was dark now, the quiet night settling over the rest stop like a blanket. The flashing lights of the police cars were the only signs of the chaos that had just unfolded. Michael took a deep breath, letting the cold air clear his head. He had done what he could. He had stepped in when it mattered most. And now it was time to let the authorities take over. Still, he couldn't shake the weight that lingered in his chest. He had seen the worst that people were capable of in his time as a Marine, But there was something especially heart-wrenching about seeing it here, so close to home, in such an ordinary place. The door to the diner creaked open behind him, and Zoe's father stepped out, looking weary but relieved. He walked over to Michael, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice soft. "But I'm just so thankful you were there. I know I've said it 100 times, but you saved my little girl's life." Michael nodded, accepting the thanks, but not dwelling on it. "She's going to be okay," he said firmly. "You both are." Zoe's father smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Yeah, we'll get through it," he said. It's a lot to process, you know. I thought we were past all of this." Michael understood. He had seen it time and time again, the moment when people realized that their lives weren't as safe or secure as they thought, that danger could come from the places they least expected. It was a hard truth to accept, but it was also a reminder of why people needed to trust their instincts, to be vigilant, even in the most ordinary of situations. "Take it one day at a time," Michael advised quietly. "Zoe's strong. You're strong. You'll get through this." Zoe's father nodded, glancing back toward the diner where his daughter was sitting quietly with one of the officers. "Yeah," he murmured. "We will." As the night wore on and the police continued their investigation, Michael knew it was time for him to go. He had done what he came to do. He had stepped in, trusted his instincts, and helped save a life. Now it was time for Zoe and her father to begin their journey of healing, and for the justice system to take over. Before he left, Michael approached Zoe one last time. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her small body still huddled close to her father's side. "You take care of yourself, okay?" he said gently. "And remember, you're safe now." Zoe nodded, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said one last time. And though her voice was soft, the sincerity in it was undeniable. Michael smiled and gave her a small wave as he turned to leave, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. He had done what needed to be done, and though the road ahead would be long for Zoe and her father, he knew they would find their way through it. Together. As Michael drove away from the rest stop, the quiet night enveloping him, he reflected on the events of the day. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought on the battlefield. They were fought in the everyday moments, in the decisions to act when others might turn away. And sometimes, those small acts of courage were the ones that mattered most.